This is the 40th anniversary of Transport Chicago. It's just kind of amazing, right? So what we've done in this session is we've brought three of us here who are going to represent different eras in what was going on, and we're going to be playing as sort of a tag team. We're going to be discussing not just nostalgia. We're not just here for nostalgia, maybe a little bit, right? But also to kind of tell you a little bit about what was going on in the region and what this organization can tell you about sort of the evolving nature of being a transportation professional in Chicago. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to introduce the three of us. We're going to say a few words about ourselves. So this is me on the left. This is Ian Savage. I'm a professor at Northwestern. And I'm going to talk about the earliest era. I wasn't at number 1, which is in 1986. I wasn't at number 2 either, or number 3, or number 4, or number 5. The first one I went to was number 6 in 1990. And what I was involved then was in the committee through most of the 1990s. I was on the committee member from 1991 through 1999. I was the vice president 1 year with Brad Thompson was president running it. I was the treasurer for 5 years from 94 through 99, right? But you may ask yourself, given the fact he wasn't at the first 5, why is he up on the stage? That's a good question, right? And the reason why that was, on our 10th anniversary, we commissioned a history of ourselves. We were very proud that we got to 10 years. So we wrote a history. This was what it was, right? And it was given to everyone who came along to the 1995 conference. And I was the author of this, so I actually got to meet and speak to many of the people who originated. So that's why I'm up here. So Chris is going to be next.
Great. Thanks, Ian. So I won the student paper competition back in 1997. And I remember at the wine and cheese reception, that's something that goes back back before I was involved in anything with Transport Chicago. It's a long-standing tradition. At the Wine and Cheese, somebody suggested, would you like to join the steering committee? And feeling inclined toward the organization at the time, I said yes. I ended up staying, not always necessarily on the committee such that I got into the proceedings, but I moderated the paper selection sessions for many years, up until about 2006 or 2007. And at one point, I think I was treasurer for at least a year, although there's a little bit of that that's been lost to history as well. But it's been a great run. One of the things that I think I brought to the conference was the first consultant to really be on it for multiple years. And over time, I encouraged my colleagues to follow in my footsteps and take over for me when I started winding down on the committee. And I'm very pleased. We've now had a couple of presidents that I encouraged to get involved in the committee. Steve Brown a few years ago, and this year's Lucy Chen. So it's been a wonderful constant through my career to kind of been going to this thing for almost 30 years now.
Perfect. Hello, everybody. I'm Emily Tapia-Lopez. I'm going to round this out with the 2010-2019 group. Like many of you probably here, I got adopted by transportation. That was not, I was not the 10-year-old that said I'm going to be a CEO of a transit agency, but it's one of those things, being a Chicago brat, born and raised in the city of Chicago, seeing the Orange Line get developed, Midway transforming, right? Lots of different things that I've experienced personally, and I am a proud MUP, so for all the MUPs out there. We did a lot of work in urban planning and public affairs, and I was approached by a colleague, Mark Miner, many of you guys, who was president before, and said, you know what, this is a great organization, you should get involved, I really need some help, you gotta help me get some more people, we gotta bring in some a lot of groups together, and let's try to make this, this conference, let's take it to the next level. So that's how I got involved in Transport Chicago. I have absolutely loved my experience. It was very, very rewarding to see the conference and to see it come together after all these, smaller group meetings and all kinds of organic connections that we made. And I'm so pleased to see that continues on in its legacy as we move forward today and beyond.
Okay, so what we're going to do is, before we talk about the organization, just to give you an idea of what was going on in the time periods we were doing with, because in many ways the conference reflects what was going on in the city and things like that. We're not going to spend too much time on that. And certainly for me, Luann this morning, who was on the committee with me, said much of it. So in 1986, I wasn't actually living in Chicago. I didn't move here until August 1986. I wasn't here at the very first conference. But as we saw at that time, the North Main line joined with the Englewood-Jackson Park line. There was no line out to Midway. And we didn't call the train lines by their colors, which actually, incidentally, was actually announced at this conference. The very first announcement of that, so it's very good. If you want to ride the L, you could pay with cash, of course. That thing on the right, you use the token, right? Available at your local Dominick's and Jewel and the currency exchange, as well as from a person in a booth, so you could do that, right? Harold Washington, as we see, was mayor. The big controversy, of course, was we saw from Luann, was the lights at Wrigley Field at that time. We did have a flood in the loop. A lot of transportation was involved in the causes of this and the consequences of it, right? And of course, if we had to think through the 1990s, one thing defined Chicago in the 1990s, and that was Michael Jackson and the Bulls. So it's Michael Jordan, Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson defined the 1990s as well, but Michael Jordan certainly did, right? So too many Michaels, right? So Chris.
Yeah, by the time we got to 2000, we started out with a big party and a big sigh of relief because the world's computer systems didn't stop working as soon as we turned over to 2000. That was called Y2K at the time. Transport Chicago put a new logo together, and a few years later, we actually got Millennium Park, that has been obviously huge draw for Chicago over the years. Middle of the decade, the White Sox won the World Series, and then we had a Great Recession. I don't think they were related necessarily, but they, after the Great Recession, created an opportunity for an aspiring Chicago politician, and we had the Obamas go to the White House. So that was an excellent way to sort of round out the end of my decade.
Speaking of the Obamas, so they started off an initiative called the Sustainable Communities Initiative, and that's where we started to do more stuff on bus rapid transit. Let's take a look at privatizing some assets, which came with its set of challenges and problems. But this was the first time that we were looking at transportation investments from not only the DOT perspective, but also housing and the environment. It was an ambitious plan. It was something that, as advocates, I was at the Metropolitan Planning Council when this was kicking off, and we were advocating for those sorts of investments of planning transit near housing. Imagine that. So crazy. But, being able to quantify that, taking those initial steps, and then looking at how federal grants were being rolled out to various cities in various degrees of success, but taking a look at how those investments could continue to move forward. I joke with Rick Harnish because he became one of the most popular guys of the time when high-speed rail got an infusion of $8 billion worth of investment, which we're still fighting the good fight on that one. BRT, we talked a little bit about that. The initial stages of the loop link we have today, and some of the other corridors, which we're still, I know, working and advocating for. Lots of corridors, lots of need, lots of opportunity to really make sure that buses have a good place in our transit system, and that we can help share that more broadly with our local communities, and see what that value could look like. Kyle, I see is here. I know we were in Daley Plaza when we were so excited about the 2016 Olympic bid that was going to transform the way we were looking at transportation in Chicago, and womp womp. Not exactly the result we were looking for, but what that did is brought a lot of those conversations to the forefront and really gave us a chance to take a look at what those assets look like throughout our city and throughout our region.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the organization and how it reflects what's going on here. So the very first conference was held on a Thursday, June the 19th in 1986, on the campus of the University of Chicago. We'll talk about why it was there in a little bit later, right? People who were there told me there were several things. Because it was on a Thursday and class were in session, they had to have non-air conditioned space. It was 90 degrees. So somebody said it had a pretty distinct aroma as well as whatever else was going on in there. But 150 people came along. So it was organized and housed in an organization called the Center for Urban Kopp, Center for Urban Research and Policy Studies, which was part of the University of Chicago. And they actually, in many ways, administered this. And this was kind of a brand name of theirs for the first 3 years. And then, for some reason, that center got closed down by the university, so the place found itself homeless. So in 1989, it was taken over by the University of Illinois at Chicago and the Urban Transportation Center there, which at the time was floating the idea of an Illinois Transportation Center, and they thought this could be part of what they were offering, was a conference there. So one thing that did start changing was from 1991 onwards, instead of being called sponsored by University of Illinois Chicago, it was called hosted by. And then in 1992 to 1993, it became a corporation. So we know it's Transport Chicago. Its real name, in terms of how the IRS knows it, is still the Metropolitan Conference on Public Transportation Research, and this is the bylaws from it. And next to it, back in that sort of dot matrix printer, is our letter from the IRS giving us not-for-profit status. So in effect, then we became our own organization and not tied to any university. Then 1997, the first appearance of the word Transport Chicago. So for a couple of years up to that point, we'd actually had a name for each conference. We'd had titles. You'll see some a bit later. And we got to the point where we were A, sick of thinking of a new title each year. B, we were getting lots of papers which weren't just on public transportation. We had papers on the tollway expansion into Lake County on Route 53. Well, that didn't exactly happen, right? On parking and on pedestrians and urban freight. So I actually came up with the name Transport Chicago. I'd lived in the late 80s as a University of British Columbia, faculty member there. And in Canada, they switched the names round on this, right? So it could be bilingual. Transport Canada, their DOT, right, for example. So that's why I said we would call it Transport Chicago. And I'm sure the CTA and the RTA have regretted ever since then that we stole this name back in the early days of the internet to do that. So I came up with the name, but what I found out earlier was this gentleman here came up with the graphic, with the skyline graphic that went with it. So that was kind of the big expansion out from public transportation to considering other forms of urban mobility. We even had the tagline, Chicagoland's, i.e. city and suburbs, annual mobility conference. And that time we were very pleased. We've been going on since 1986, right? So, Chris.
Great. So in 2000, we started putting proceedings onto CD-ROMs. It used to be a big printed booklet. A lot of those CD-ROMs have been lost to history. A few of them have been found. If anybody has one, we'd love to add those to the online archive and just have the papers that were presented at some of those early years.
What years are you missing, Chris?
Probably about 1999 to 2004. So yeah, if you rifle through your office, that'd be great. And then by 2003, we came up with another new logo, the Chiclet logo, as I call it. And in 2004, moved over to the IIT Herman Hall, where this was kind of a common theme among the steering committee during those years. There was always sort of this existential crisis. And David Kralik reminded me of this when we were talking about it a couple of weeks ago, is how we were often finding ourselves looking for a venue where we could have it. And we were really on a shoestring budget at the time compared to where we are today. By 2009, we moved to the American Dental Association building. And one of the things that I put together kind of getting ready for this was a timeline of the leadership. If you go down to the museum room and the shop room, you'll see some timelines of who's been on the committee over the years. There's 300 people who've been on the committee over the years, 700 person years of time on the committee over the years. And this is how it's grown. So we're up to, about 40 people. Back in the 2000s to 2009, we hit 20 for the first time. And so you can see how this has really snowballed in terms of the size of the conference, the production quality of the conference over time.
So we took that logo and we continued to build on it. And this is one of my favorites. We had, Charlotte had found a graphic designer and she's like, we're gonna take this program and it's gonna be awesome. So we did. One of the things that we looked at, a lot of the folks that were on the committee came from a transit and had a transit background, and we were all kind of transit enthusiasts. But we did make a intentional look at how we could attract other industries, other groups, and I know that there had been some papers before, but having them on the committee, having them a little bit more vested in what we were trying to do, helped us bring more sponsors and helped us attract more sponsors to continue to elevate the wine and cheese, as well as some of the other offerings that we had with Transport Chicago. We had focused on attracting more students, bringing more students into the fold, not so much to make it a student-led conference, but we were finding that we were actually making a lot of connections for students to hire young talent, connecting them with different, really maximizing that networking opportunity to make sure that they were making the kinds of connections that could open up new job opportunities and attracting this young talent into not only the committee, but getting full-time employment as well. Expanded footprint at the Dental Association. It was a great venue. It was a good space for us to continue to expand and grow. I actually found an old Facebook post from Charlotte we're so close. We only had 5 more people to register so that we could pass the 300 mark. And it was a big victory for us. I mean, we had seen how the organization had evolved, but then attracted so many new folks to the organization itself. And then, it was really making sure, like I said, to talk about how we could engage those in rail. We had BNSF come in as a sponsor to talk about transit investments and transit projects. I mean, we were able to recruit and attract a whole new pool of untapped resources that were helping us continue to professionalize the organization and the conference itself.
So what was the conference discussing? So this is where we went back to proceedings and our agendas. In 1986, down in little type at the bottom is some organization which is now long defunct, which was called the Academy of Information and Planning. So who were these people? So these were a bunch of people who were young transit professionals who were interested in something that was really stunning, the introduction of the desktop computer for doing transportation planning work. So that was a group that got together and was one of the sponsors. And actually, if we look at the proceedings when you get to the late 90s, we saw the first arrival of GIS, and that led to sort of recurring sessions on that type. There were certain evergreen topics. I was in a session this morning on transit-oriented development. We had it then as well. We used to call it joint development, was a phrase that people used at the time. Always had people from the CTA talking about survey methodologies, people talking about using census data. We had kind of doom and gloom as course. Our 1992 conference was called Can Transit Be Saved? This could have been the 2032 conference, right? You could use the same name, right? And this was sort of an evergreen sort of topic and things. But other things that are kind of interesting is in the middle there, it's under 1992, Luann talked about it this morning, the issue of the Clean Air Act, which she didn't discuss, but led to the CMAQ money, right? But also led to potentially restrictions on commuting, which never occurred. So that led to a lot of discussion. The ADA had occurred, but it didn't exactly specify what the ADA meant. So there was many conferences in the early 90s we were discussing what exactly did we want to do. Financial fights were always there. 1993, it sounded like a conversation we had just before lunchtime in the room just back there. Transportation wars, city versus the suburbs, right? This name came from a comedian called Aaron Freeman, who was had a long night running late night review talking about the council wars, which was a fight between a group of aldermen and Mayor Harold Washington. So that's we took the name for that, and this was sort of discussing. Actually, on this 1992 one, there's something in the middle on measuring quality. There's some speakers there. Whatever happened to that Leanne Redden person who was one of our 1992 speakers, right? So it just shows you, people who were speaking here many years ago end up being leaders there. Obviously, we had other things we were discussing. There was the circulator came and went. In fact, actually, a number of people from the circulator organization were on the steering committee here. Probably the most bizarre, but actually had the biggest attendance of any session, was 1991, personal rapid transit. If I had to describe this to you, you would think this is stupid, right? This was little pods running on an elevated something or other somewhere in Rosemont. Why, right? But boy, did we get a big attendance when we had that as our closing session on that one. So that was kind of the big discussions in the 1990s. Some of them not that different than the sort of things we could discuss today. Chris?
So I put a little matrix together of the various themes that kept recurring over time. And some of the most popular ones, I mean, we've always had sort of a report out of what the service board's market research folks are doing that year. You know, the results of the most recent survey, how this is being translated into, you know, making various decisions about where ridership is and where to deploy service. We've always had a lot about travel demand modeling. There's usually been a session on that, as well as technology, another very popular one. Policy and funding, as Ian mentioned, is something that comes up from year to year. The exact flavor of that changes, of course, over time. But modeling, land use, TOD, project planning, these things are all things that recurred at least throughout that period between 2000 and 2009, and still things that we talk about today. A couple of the other things that were going on at the time, and Luann covered a lot of this morning, but we saw our merger of our planning agencies, and we also started talking a lot about asset sales and the pros and cons of those things. And that took up a number of sessions over the years as well.
So we took ourselves seriously, but not too seriously. We still had some fun with all the sessions. Safety dance, America's Next Top Freight Model. You know, I mean, we had a lot of really creative people who were on the committee. And I really remember as we're sitting around the room looking and evaluating all of our colleagues' submittals for the conference and really trying to package together as many opportunities, shortening the time frame that they were going to be speaking so we could get more people to speak. We were very strategic about how we made sure to have as many people in the room to participate and be involved with all these different sessions, and then just had fun. We had a lot of fun with it. We were able to take some very serious topics. As Chris mentioned, it's not the first time that we've faced a crisis in transportation. But, you know, it was how do we humanize it? How do we make sure that we have the right people in the room having those conversations? And I think, you know, that was one of the things that as we would have these conversations and have this, it felt like it was in a safe space, right? You could have this conversation, you could give all this insight, but you were able to have convene all these different professionals and really create an environment to tackle some really difficult and complicated transportation issues.
Now, of course, any organization is really just the people who are part of it. So that's what we want to kind of a little bit reflect on here. And so I'm going to talk about the early stages here. So one person's name is kind of associated with the organization origins, but people in 1995 told me, don't overplay this guy's name, right? In the sense that there were others as well. But the name that always comes up is a man called Larry Anderson, who departed this area for Austin, Texas in the late 80s. But he'd been a recent graduate in the public policy school at master's graduate at the University of Chicago. And he was at the Illinois Department of Transportation and then at the CTA. And he and some of the people of a similar sort of early career as him were having trouble getting funding to go to conferences, particularly to the TRB annual meetings in Washington in January. So in effect, they wanted to kind of set up for what was described at the time as a TRB for the hometown team. So that's kind of what he was doing. So how did he go about doing this? Well, he actually went to see a couple of people, and along with some other people as well. One is Lady Pastora Cafferty at the top left. She was in the public policy school at the University of Chicago, but more importantly, served 2 very long stretches on the boards of the RTA. So that was able to sort of get the sort of official connections in the public policy school at the University of Chicago and from the transit management side of things. And then he also went to his thesis advisor, George Tolley, who was a economics professor at the University of Chicago, who was his thesis advisor and was the very first chair of the first year of the conference, right? So the name itself, Metropolitan Conference on Public Transportation Research, MCPTR, or certain people like Chris used to refer to as M-Copter, which I hated a lot, right? But certain people did. So a man called Jim Jarzab, who was well known for propping up the wine and cheese, particularly the wine part of it, at the parties at the end of the early years. He was at NIPSI, who's then later at Pace. He came up with the name, which I think was highly descriptive, but not exactly very brief, right, or snappy, right?
Thus M-Copter.
Yes, M-Copter, right? So when it went to the University of Illinois at Chicago, after the University of Chicago's center kind of imploded there, there was a man called Richard Michaels there, who was director of the Urban Transportation Center, and he made a comment at the time that this little ship might turn into something big, which I think when you were down in that lunchroom today, when you realized how packed it was, you realize it made it big, right? So I think that's really incredible. So one thing I think in terms of the people who were involved is Pace was involved very much so. Partly because both their executive director and the lady who was chairman of the board there were very enthusiastic of their staff getting involved. Because back in those analog days where we used to have in-person committee meetings, down in the offices of CATS, right, you know. They would come trekking in from Arlington Heights here. And this was a way for Pace's senior management to have their junior staff actually get to meet their equivalents from elsewhere and down. So Pace was very much involved. And they actually produced the proceedings back as Chris described, which were telephone... So anyone who's young used to have books with phone numbers in it, right? So that's what the proceedings looked like as well. And that was done by their printing department at Pace after they finished doing the school timetable. So you realise we were living in a very paper-centric age, right? So there's a committee for 1993. Our keynote speaker is down there in the middle centre, right? I don't recognise some of those people at the back, right? Well, right, but I mean... So some of you may know some of these people. Ken Dalmar, who's the bottom right, was attendee here for many years. And so there was a kind of a lie put out by the management of this organisation about 10 years ago. This was formerly a student-run organisation. This was never a student-run organisation. You know, Larry Anderson and Jim Jarzab and the people of their similar career trajectory were the same people in 1986 as the 1982 or 1985 or as is today. This has always been an organisation for 20-somethings and 30-somethings as a way of networking and to sort of build themselves up into their careers, right? So in many ways, Transport Chicago was the young professionals in transportation before we'd even thought of that organisation. So that's who we are. So I also want to point out this organisation has some very strong female leadership over the time. Going back to the very first days, Deborah Stone, the Metropolitan Planning Council, yeah. Nina Savar from NIPSI, right, who was very involved in starting us out on the road to corporate things. Luann, obviously, right. Lynette Savarella was part of the PACE crowd and then went to Metra. So at least in the eras there, I was there, some very strong female leadership, even though that picture kind of suggests something different, right? The other thing you'll notice in that period was men wore neckties, and in the early 90s, the neckties were loud, right? So,
all right, yeah. Ian mentioned how it's always been kind of a group of young professionals making up the steering committee. I wanted to just sort of call out a few of the young professionals, at least from my era on the committee, who've now made it into senior leadership positions in their organizations. So mentioned Lynette Ciavarella, now running the planning group at Metra. At the city of Chicago, we had Natasha now McMillan, who became alder for the 7th Ward after serving on the committee. We got Joe Schwieterman here at running the Chaddick Institute over at DePaul. Metropolitan Planning Council, Audrey Wenig, was on the committee for a long time and is now running a big part of that organization. And then you got Joe Iacobucci at CTA at the time, now running the new mobility practice at TY Lin. So those are just a few of them. There's a number of others that I'm sure I've missed, but it's been great to see how many people sort of started their careers at Transport Chicago and are now doing big things.
We were so cute. So this was our committee. You'll see a lot of familiar faces in the room today. We were scrappy, but man, we had a lot of heart. And you can tell, I think this photo really captures that. This is after the wine and cheese. But this definitely was after a long, there's a lot of familiar faces in there. And I really think that, yes, it was run by young professionals. Yes, it was something that we would come together and work together to, really build long-lasting friendships. I mean, I've seen several of you guys today, and it's like we don't miss a beat. The power of the network that this organization provides is truly something that, no matter where you go in your career, it's a thread that really does create this friendship, this bond. If I have a question about something, I don't have to say, who should I call? There's a helping hand at any moment ready to assist. And I think that is truly what this organization embodies. And throughout all of the different eras, we just had a lot of fun, and it was a good time. We did a lot of hard work. I think one of the things that I truly appreciated was we each hosted one of the meetings, so we got a chance to go around from office to office too, and have a chance to work together in a foreign environment. But really get a chance to build that network, build that camaraderie, go out for happy hour afterwards, and just kind of truly build what that network was looking like that continues throughout your entire career. So that was just a fun one to include.
So, happy birthday, Transport Chicago, right? So,
Here.
We have a show of hands. Who all was on the steering committee over time?
Yeah.
All right. This is your session.
So,
Any questions?
yeah, so we're going to open this up. So I think, as you see, we weren't just here for pure nostalgia. Some of it is sort of reflections on what's changed in the profession and what issues we could discuss in 1986 and we could discuss today, and it would be the same issue, right? But maybe we can do some. So we're going to pass the microphone around, and Lucy's going to come and do that, and then we'll come and be part of the conversation here. So we have about 20 minutes or so to do this. So please.
Hi, so my name is Amanda Madrigal. I'm at CTA. I've been with CTA for about 7 years. My first Transport Chicago was in 2016. I just finished undergrad, and I came back to Chicago to go to grad school at UIC for the MUP program. And I didn't know anyone when I came to Transport Chicago. I went just as myself, by myself, and I didn't know anyone. I was very intimidated. And I think the one I remember was actually Chris. You had a presentation on Divi, and I could roll location of Divi stations, you know. But now I can't turn around without seeing somebody I know, and so I think that camaraderie has been really great. But so thank you. I feel like I grew within this organization, alongside the organization. So my question is, from your perspective, what topics or presentations have you seen over the years that you feel had the most impact or the most influence on people? Oh, that actually made a difference. That actually changed perspectives or ideas. Just a long-lasting impact. Because sometimes I feel like we all get excited and this is so interesting, but nothing ever happens. So, is there any topics over the years that you recall that really made a difference?
Thank you. So one that comes to mind, the year that we were starting to think about who the keynote was going to be, right? And we were trying to think through what keynote, and we went through the laundry list of the usual, what I like to call the usual suspects, right? And for a long time, most of the people that we asked to speak, because it just worked out well, were mostly local folks. And I think when we started to bridge out into other cities and have them come in to not only give us the opportunity to teach them a little bit about our system, but hear some of the commonalities with some of these other markets. I think that once we started doing and bridging out a little bit further, that really started to help kind of frame the conference itself from, just, I've heard this already, whether it was WTS or IRTBA or ACC or pick whatever acronym of, of organization. It was really kind of having that dual perspective of someone from another market and then someone locally to be able to have those different conversations. And then the other piece that I would say is from a local perspective of the individual breakout sessions. Some of the stuff that really came in is when someone it was more the speaker, when they truly felt passionate about what information. It was infectious, and you could tell the audience responded to that.
I would say we had a couple of ones in the early 90s where we used to have a closing plenary session, and one year we got, in effect, they probably didn't call in those days, the CEO of each of Pace, Metro, and the CTA up there, and the year after, or 2 years after, we got the board chairs from these three organizations up there. And I think we actually, in one of the years I moderated, one of the years we got a journalist to moderate it. I think we got Ken Davis, who was the program director of WBZ at the time, to moderate this. And I think for a lot of people in the room, these are the people they work for, but they never got to meet, right? So this was, I just remember people seeing it, and it was a contentious time. So, we did a lot of hard discussions, and people were hearing them actually speak on topics which, which were being pitched to them, which, the answers were not exactly obvious, right? So it was Chris.
Yeah, first of all, I share your thoughts on just what a great group of people this is. It comes together every year. I've thought about this as sort of the family reunion of transportation for Chicago, and it's absolutely been that. In terms of some of the more momentous sessions that we've had, I can remember a number of rather controversial ones. I mean, we've had a lot of debates over the right way to take transportation forward in Chicago over the years. And a lot of times those debates have happened here in some of the sessions. I can think of one about, should the red line extension be a CTA thing or a Metra thing? And that debate playing out over probably several conferences. And people presenting data and people just simply having political arguments and a lot of that stuff sort of happening in this forum. Another thing that's happened is, I think in the 2000s or so, we started really reaching out and seeing, who is that current leader in a certain area thinking about transportation, and let's invite them in for the keynote. And we really raised our game over the years in terms of bringing in people who were very prominent, may have just published a book or something like that, and really helped the draw and getting us, past the 200 mark and now the 300 mark in terms of attendance.
Okay.
We actually hit 400.
400.
Oh,
Well done, Lucy.
Hi, Kyle Whitehead, RTA. Thank you all, and thank everybody in this room has been on the steering committee. I have never volunteered, but I appreciate all of you that have. One thing we heard in your presentation and in others here today, there's been lots of projects over the years that have been proposed that have not yet come to fruition. And I know you all are experts on this. So what is one project that if you could snap your fingers and it would exist in Chicago tomorrow, what would that project be?
I'll start. I would love to see the West Loop Transportation Center in some form. Maybe slightly different uses of the different levels, but that would be a really transformative project for the region. A lot of my work over the last, 20 years really has been sort of discovering and then helping make the case for why Chicago, instead of being the end point of all the railroads, should really become a through station in part of a larger national network. And the West Loop Transportation Center would be a big part of that.
I would say it's not a capital project, but I would just say an integrated fair payment system.
Yeah,
right?
that's come up a lot.
I know. I'm obviously. I wasn't born here. I was born in London, so but I've lived in Chicago for 40 years. But when I was a kid, London was as fragmented as it is now, right? The National Rail one, separate ticketing. You just walk with your Oyster card there, and you can just move from a suburban train to a bus to the subway and various different. We could do the same here. In fact, actually, given the fact that the Oyster cards and the Venture is the same damn product, right? This is just crazy, And I think that's what I would do. I mean, I'm not a big fan necessarily of everything being branded. And if you go to London, you realize next to nothing is owned by Sadiq Khan, right? It's all owned under franchises or contracts or something like that. But as a user, you regard this as one system, right? And so that's what I would do.
I'd say a national high-speed rail network that truly is integrated and finally puts us on the map with the rest of the world that has a high-speed rail network.
National BRT is the right answer. That's the right answer. There's only one right answer.
Hi, Mark Pitstick, RTA. Been going to the conferences for at least 30 years and presenting sometimes multiple things in one year, probably peaking in the early, sometimes with Chris, many times with Chris. You mentioned, Ian, at the beginning, it was Metropolitan Conference on Public Transportation Research, right. And it was meant to be kind of like a mini TRB, a local TRB, and there was a heavy focus on research at the beginning. I remember having some papers rejected because they weren't research focused, but that seems to have gone by the wayside, and I think we also had to write a paper, right? I don't know if that's still the case. So why don't you talk a little bit about the evolution of that, about research and presentations on projects, and then papers and not papers and things like that.
Yes, let's say I do think that some of your observations there, Mark, is actually true of academics in general, speaking to someone who is a professional, right, in the sense, a professional academic. And there was a time where when you went to a conference, you had a paper. And that has become less and less true. But certainly in academic circles, you at least have something you present rather than it isn't just all panels. So I do think we've just seen in the profession a movement away from papers towards posters and panels. And I realize in certain disciplines, like for example in my wife's discipline, which is in biology and biological sciences, right? Their conferences don't look anything like ours do. Everything is posters, and then the plenary and other sessions are panels and big name people talking. It's not podium sessions as TRB calls it. So that's certainly changed. We did require papers in those days, which were published in the proceedings. And in fact, actually, probably that's one of the things we've lost over time, is that when we went away from proceedings to a website, it became ethereal. And I don't think it's wrong for the fact that we get together and we discuss public policy things and people come to the room and they're discussing their experiences rather than research and things like that. So, but certainly that has certainly changed. And if we were just a research conference, we'd still be 150 people, right? The fact we're 400 people and it's everybody you could imagine, right? In terms of people from community associations, housing development people, all these sorts of things where this is not part of the research crowd. I mean, I do think that serious research should still be encouraged because otherwise it's just empty talk, right? But I mean, we always have to talk to each other, right? But I mean, there's got to make sure there's some basis behind it. So that's my observation. I think things have become far more informal in all aspects of professional life in the last 40 years, and this is no exception to it.
Yeah, I think it was probably during my time on the committee that we relaxed that constraint and sort of went to, just send us a PowerPoint presentation, and then I don't know how much of that is even necessarily always getting recorded. So, but it is part of a trend in terms of just the less formal ways of communicating information. And as we're getting more graphical, I mean, eventually I imagine when we do the 50th anniversary, we'll be talking about how we're using videos to basically convey information about a lot of our technical findings.
I think the goal of being approachable and being as open as we could, we kind of balanced those that submitted technical presentations with those that could give some, perspectives as well, and then balance that throughout each of the panels, and then just try to be as intentional with that kind of structure.
I mean, I think in terms of serious research, this conference has come pretty devoid of that in recent times, right? And there's nothing wrong about that. It's just the industry is fragmented, and even if you go to TRB, sort of the serious research has become smaller and smaller proportion of it, right? And this stuff goes on, but it goes on somewhere else. Yeah.
Good afternoon. I really enjoyed the history lesson. That was very interesting. So my name is Erica Miles, and I'm with Community Investment Corporation. And to speak to what you were saying about the, expanding the reach and the intersectionality, we're actually in real estate. So I specialize more in affordable housing. But this is my third conference because the first one I came to, there was a session on the Red Line extension. I was like, let's talk about that. So I really appreciate the ability to learn things from a different perspective and to see how they overlap.
I think it's really true. One thing we noticed is, branding in '97, Chicago's Urban Mobility Conference. And that was talking about multimodal things, right? So I do think it's not entirely unrelated to what happened with ICE-T in '91. And I think there's always been an involvement in urban design. I mean, as you say, we used to call it joint development or TOD in more recent times. I remember when our friend Ken Dalmeyer presented the CTA's document on when the Lake Street part of the L, what we now know as the Green Line, was going to potentially be closed, but when they decided to rebuild it, they were going to rebuild the neighborhoods around it with sort of complementary uses close by it, which, all these things which maybe we don't have nowadays, like, dry cleaners and news agents or something like that, but at the time was the sort of thing you had next to the L station, right? And so I remember that document was being presented there. So, I mean, it's one of I always tell my students in class, right, transportation and land use, it's a two-way street, right, and you can't talk about one without the other. So, I mean, it's no surprising we're discussing urban land use, right? I mean, we don't have the land use, we don't have any need for transportation, right? So it's, yeah.
I'm glad you're here. I think you're reflective of a larger trend that we've been seeing for at least 10 years now. One of the things that happened as the transportation management associations were formed in the suburbs, like the Lake Cook TMA, is we started seeing more and more interest from organizations that weren't necessarily transportation organizations. And if you even look at the composition of the steering committee, we're not just the transportation agencies and the transportation consultants like it's been for so long. It's now a lot of organizations that are, consumers of transportation, but interested enough in transportation issues that they'll get involved in an organization like this.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dimitris Nioras. I used to be the former president, 2324. First of all, thank you for your leadership and for shaping the conference to what it is today. And thank you to everybody else in the room whose name is downstairs in the timeline. My question to you is more of trying to get a bright note into a very concerning issue that we are these days. And I'm talking about the transit fiscal cliff. You probably have been through multiple fiscal cliffs over the last 40 years. I would like to see if you have any thoughts on like what you're seeing this year versus the previous times, and if there are any positive notes for us to be hopeful about the future of transit in the region. Thank you.
You're going to set me off on a 30-minute diatribe here, which I won't do. My position here is that I don't think it's even last 40 years. I remember we had Dave Young, the former Tribune writer, who presented here and wrote a history of Chicago transit. He has a thing saying, transit in Chicago has been going through fiscal crisis since about 1905, right? So it's so it's his own. I mean, I do think the cliff is steeper here now, and when you lose so much ridership through COVID, and if COVID has changed, we talked about land use just now, but just work patterns. I mean, boy, I could have a car to myself on the Purple Line this morning, right? And because it was a Friday, and this is really tough for transit, right? If you're down to a 3-day-a-week peak, that's pretty bad. Transit was bad in the 1950s when people went from 6 days a week working to 5, right? Now we're down to 3. This is tough, and my observation in life is that things will always work out, and probably the taxpayer's pocket is going to be raided in some ways, right, through one tax or another. But somehow I always see that transit has ultimately lots of friends in politics in Springfield. So this comes to us out, whether we... And I do think that we had presentations in 2005, 2007, discussion on that, right? It's certainly correct that whatever you do now, the guys in Springfield and ladies in Springfield are not going to be happy you coming back in the next 15 years for the next go-round, right? So you do need something that's going to at least put your way through 10 or 15 years, but I have a lot more to say on this subject, but I won't, right?
I would say that the biggest thing that it highlights over the decades is the fact that we haven't adequately funded transit at the level it needs to be since the beginning. And that is one of the things that front and center, we have prioritized New Starts programs, we have prioritized at the federal level. Springfield's another issue because we haven't invested there either, but we've got fare box recovery ratios, we've got all kinds of issues that we know we need to address, and we need to still make it an equitable service that needs to be provided for a city to thrive, right? So I think until we solve this issue at the federal level, to be honest, because that is an investment that is made across the country, and we've looked at for years and years and years New Starts programs and prioritized all kinds of other pieces without taking care of the immediate needs right off the bat. So that's one issue that I would bring up. I also go back to thinking about moving beyond congestion, and we came up with a dedicated revenue stream at the time. We looked at the real estate transfer tax, and then the housing market crashed. I remember buying my first condo at the time and being like, I'm contributing to the transit solution, and then we were under. So, I mean, I think that, really identifying those sorts of revenue sources are critical. I think continuing to make the case, not just when it's on fire, but when throughout of the value and the impact that transit investments have for our economy, for our jobs, and for our future. I think those are the types of things that we just need to make sure are continuous. The fight doesn't stop whenever a solution is found. Should a solution be found, which a solution really needs to be found. But I think that that's part of the continuous education that we need to make sure is consistent. Not that the sky is falling, but that there's always a need to continue to invest in our transit network.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to try to predict exactly what the legislation that comes out of Springfield, hopefully in near-term months, looks like. But a couple of encouraging things. I think number one, we talked about at this conference for years what an aberration the 50% recovery ratio requirement is in Illinois. And it looks like the pandemic may have finally broken that for us. So we'll see if that actually comes out, but that would be very encouraging. I think another thing is if you look across the country, we're not the only place with lower ridership following the pandemic. We're not the only place that's discovered that the things that we expect our transportation system and our transit system to do are not measured well by ridership, and have come up with the funding one way or another to make sure we continue to get those benefits for society. And so I think Springfield will step up. It looks different everywhere that's had to debate this, but you know, the devil's in the details. Let's see what we get this summer.
We have time for one more if someone feels confident that they have a good one.
Hi, my name is Heather. I work for WSP now, and I recently moved back to Chicago, and I'm still adjusting to the level of traffic. It has always been bad, but I have never seen congestion like the last 6 months. And collectively, as a community, it is going to impact all of our quality of life, economic growth, if we don't address it. And obviously, transit is a very, so critical, and if we're cutting service, right, when we're getting the most traffic. But it's a livability issue, and I just want to pose it as something that I'm thinking a lot about. But how do we tie those two things together? And how do we mitigate that so people can have a high quality of life and even be able to get to the train on a bus? So I know it's a big question, but it is definitely seemed to be a growing issue here in the Chicagoland area.
I think what we need to recognize here is that, circulation in the loop is not where the congestion is. I mean, it's congested, right? We all know that, right? But I mean, this isn't Manhattan. This isn't Singapore. This isn't Stockholm. This isn't London, right? So a cordon around the loop is not what we're going to do to deal with congestion. Where congestion is on the expressways and not the bits controlled by the tollways. On this discussion for years about, are we going to rebuild the Stevenson with paid lanes? And I think when you look around the country, that is what has happened, from starting State Route 91 in Orange County through how you're funding transportation in Florida, in Atlanta, on and off in Texas, right, and these sorts of places. So I do think that this is something which we're going to be discussing, but this is not necessarily things which would lead to a funding stream for transit. It might do, but I don't see that as the issue. So, I mean, I do think we're in a different situation than the MTA is in New York, simply because of the geography of our area. So.
Well, I think one of the encouraging things, I guess, about congestion is if you have to have congestion, at least it helps build support for potential solutions to congestion, like bus lanes on our arterials. This is a huge opportunity that we've barely tapped here in Chicago, is building a really good grid of BRT services on our big arterial streets. And if we can use the congestion argument to help make the case for the somewhat counterintuitive solution, which is give some space away from the cars that are in congestion and give it to transit, we may very well end up better off.
Something that comes to mind during the pandemic, everybody was ordering Amazon, right? Every single person was just sitting at home, clicking on, and we just increased, right? There's lots more trucks, lots more goods that were going throughout the region. I think the more we think about the relationship between our transportation network as a whole with our land use decisions. I think that's really going to be a key that we need to continue to keep front of mind as we're continuing to develop and as we're continuing to look at how are people getting from point A to point B, and then all the little side trips along the way, right? And how are we making that sort of those land use decisions, that economic development, and creating a tie that is very intentional, but makes, but has a strong connection, so that we can think about our transportation investments aligned with where people are going.